Hi, I'm David Guttenfelder. I'm the team leader for the Green Team at this year's workshop. I'm going to sort of take you on a story about my life and my work as a photographer, and I know that it won't be the same as your work and your path, but I hope that you can draw from it and apply it to your own sort of journey as you work towards who you are uniquely as a photographer. I've had a kind of broad experience over the last 30 years as a photojournalist, starting first with the Associated Press, where I was a hard news photographer covering conflict and natural disasters, the kind of wire service photographer that gets up in the middle of the night and is sent off to the world's breaking news. I've also had a number of sort of deeper, long-term projects that have been most important to me and have kind of established me as a photographer, and probably the most significant would be the work that I've done over the last 20 years in North Korea. And I'm currently an independent photographer and work primarily with National Geographic as a Nat Geo explorer. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we are doing now in 2020 as photographers and how that's all changed for each and every one of us. I started photography as a kid. I grew up in rural Iowa. My grandfather gave me a camera, and I used it not only to be creative, but for the first time to sort of try and be a storyteller. And for me, that was photographing all the farm foreclosures that were happening all around me in the 1970s in rural Iowa. Growing up in rural America, I didn't really know anybody that was a storyteller. I didn't know anybody that was a photographer. I certainly didn't know anybody that had ever traveled. I didn't know anyone who even had a passport. So, growing up in this kind of environment, it's very difficult to see over the horizon and to imagine that you could be a photojournalist. I was the first of my family to go to university, and I was definitely the first Guttenfelder to ever leave the United States. When I was an undergraduate, I traveled to Tanzania, and I spent 1.5 years there studying Swahili language and culture at the University of Dar es Salaam. This was my roommate and his grandmother. My job there, my time there while I lived in Tanzania was simple. It was to learn the language and to learn to step outside of my own culture, my own experience for the first time in my life. And it was also the first time that I ever actually used a camera as an adult. And I was taking photographs at the time, not because I thought that I wanted to be a photojournalist, but because I thought that I just wanted to bring back memories and bring back experiences that I could share with people back home. But I used those pictures early on and that experience to get my first job as a photojournalist. I worked for this paper, the Daily Iowan. It had a circulation of 9,000, and I really loved it. It was being a community journalist, covering sports, covering small news, stepping into other people's lives, multiple times a day. And I loved it, but I have to admit there was this voice in my head telling me, there's something I can do, something more that I can do as a photographer. And this was the kind of picture that I was making at the time. This is a front page photo from the Daily Iowan, a squirrel eating a nacho. So, it was obviously not the most important dramatic work. And I put this picture up not only because I wanted to, sort of make fun of my, beginnings as a photographer, but also I wanted to show this picture because this was taken in April of 1994. And there was something else that was really important happening in the world in April of 1994. In April, on the 11th, the president of Rwanda's aircraft was shot down. It sparked ethnic conflict. More than 1 million ethnic Tutsis were killed by their ethnic Hutu neighbors with farm implements, and millions of people streamed over the borders from Rwanda into neighboring Congo, Zaire, and also into Tanzania, where I had lived and where I had spent the previous couple of years of my life. It made me think this was the opportunity for me to try and go into something maybe a little more important as a photographer. I had lived there. I spoke the language fluently. There were people there who I cared about, and I wanted to find out firsthand if they were all right. So I packed my bags. I had $3,000 to my name. I put everything I owned in one backpack, and I flew to East Africa and started hitchhiking literally on the roads to try to make my way from Kenya to Rwanda. And this was the first thing that I photographed once I reached Rwanda. It was the Kigali Central Prison. This is where they were housing perpetrators of the genocide, ethnic Hutu genocidaires. And I knocked on the gate and I said, I'd like to come in and take photographs. And they said, well, there's no one here to monitor that. We can let you in, but there's nobody here that can let you out. I agreed. And I spent 3 days inside this prison photographing, and it was published on the front page of the New York Times. It was the first time that I understood that I could reach a huge audience, that my photography could maybe have an impact on the world. I didn't think that I'd stay in Africa very long. I didn't have much money, and I really thought of it as a chance to really contribute something as a photographer for the first time. But I thought I'd be there for a few months and then I'd, have to go home. But it didn't work out that way. It was a brutal time on the African continent, and I ended up going from one sort of heartbreaking, difficult story to the next, working in Liberia and Sierra Leone, and Somalia, across the continent, covering news. And that few months turned into all of my 20s. And it was in that time, that decade, almost decade, that I spent across the continent as a news photographer, that I learned that this was my calling, and that I wanted to be a photojournalist and make it my life. I have to say it was a difficult choice. The other thing that those years in Africa taught me was that I lived out of a backpack for many, many years. It took a very, very harsh personal toll. I was separated from people who I loved for, a whole decade of my life. I got sick. I was badly injured. I witnessed things that I would have a really hard time describing to you. I had very close friends, fellow photojournalists, die by my side. So at the end of that decade, I wasn't honestly sure if this was the right thing for me. And I also wasn't sure that news photography was right, because it was just such a narrow way to depict such a rich continent like Africa, and it was only part of the way that people were living. And so I honestly wasn't really sure. And then I guess I would have to say that decision was made for me. When September 11th happened, I was called to go and contribute more as a photographer. In the days right after September 11, I flew to Pakistan and drove over the border into the White Mountains, Tora Bora, which is the place we now know Osama bin Laden was in hiding. I went to Iraq, where I spent 2 years covering the US-led war, back to Afghanistan, where I spent a decade in and out of the country, covering not only the US military, but its impact, the war's impact on Afghan people's lives. This was the 4th of July. We had been walking in 114-degree heat, Marines in a firefight in southern Afghanistan. And at the end of the day, we had to dig these holes and sleep at night to protect ourselves from incoming mortar blasts. When the families of the Marines saw this picture, they recognized them by the socks that they had rolled up and stuck in their boots. I learned that my job was to get to the closest sort of center point, the epicenter of a story, and then tell the stories of people who are just right next to you and sleep on the ground next to them. That's the only thing you can do as a photojournalist. And not just, you know, Americans' involvement in the military, but Afghans who at that point had spent, you know, decades, generations living under the impact of war. So Afghanistan was sort of the place I took my stand. And I said I spent my 20s in Africa. I spent all of my 30s working primarily in Afghanistan. And Afghanistan is where National Geographic found me too. I received an email one day and from the director of photography, and the subject line said, potential National Geographic assignment. And I covered my eyes and peeked through my fingers when I opened the email because I was so scared that it would or wouldn't be true. And it was my first assignment for National Geographic. It was about how opium was funding the insurgency against the United States and agricultural alternatives. And I did it, and I did it well. And it was just the beginning of a new sort of chapter and journey in my career as a photographer. I've done stories all across the world. This is a story about the damming of the Mekong River, one of the world's last wildest rivers. And I traveled from the source in China to the delta in Vietnam to look at how the damming of the river would impact the ecology and culture of people and the people who are in the desperate need for power. National Geographic taught me that I could give voice to not only the people around me, but also other species. And this is a story I did about the killing of migratory songbirds. 6 billion songbirds migrate across the Mediterranean every year, and as many as 1 billion of them are killed for food and sport, and it's cruel and it's unsustainable. And so I became a conservation photographer, maybe of a different kind at National Geographic. When I lived in Japan, there was an earthquake. Not only that, but there was a tsunami, once in a generation tsunami that wiped out the entire coastline, and it inundated a nuclear reactor and melted down and exploded. And I spent the next 11 weeks in and out of the nuclear exclusion zone, living inside abandoned schools and in my car, trying to show what had happened to this radioactive, poisoned place and the people who had once lived there. I traveled to Cuba as it began to open up at the end of the Obama administration, and then back again when Fidel Castro died, to photograph the outpouring of grief during his funeral that drove all the way across the country for days. And then in 2014, exactly 20 years after I had left the United States with my one backpack, I came back. And I came back to try and sort of rediscover my own country again as a photographer. And at that time, National Geographic named me a National Geographic Explorer. And it's not because I climb mountains, because I don't. It's not because I dive and photograph polar bears, because I can't. But it's because they felt that I was a photographer that was still willing to step outside of my own experience and to go to places that other people weren't able or willing to go to. And so I photograph in America now. I photograph the lives of our people. I do stories about climate change, about politics, about social justice, about conservation. This is a tranquilized wolf in a place called the Pelican Valley in Yellowstone National Park. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my work in North Korea. It's the place where I dedicated the most time in my career, and it's the place that I'm asked most about, because I think it's fair to say that it is one of the least understood, most cut off, isolated places on Earth. And part of the reason why it's so cut off and so isolated and we know so little about it is that there's very few photographs that have ever come from there until recently. It's a place that for decades, there's been no sort of independent record of what's happening inside the country. And in 2012, I went as the Associated Press photographer. I helped them establish an AP bureau inside the country, and we were the first Western agency to do that. And so I became the AP North Korea photographer and was the first photographer, Western photographer, to have regular access inside the country. This is not my photo. This is a photo taken by the Korean Central News Agency. This is the kind of photography that we would normally get from North Korea. It's sort of information comes in one direction. It's distributed by the state. It shows an idyllic, sanitized, utopian kind of view of the country. You know, my view as an independent photographer there was often very different. This is the national highway that runs from Pyongyang across the country in the middle of the day, you know. So my view of the country, and even my view of what a photojournalist is and is doing inside the country, was very, very different from what they imagined. I covered the news. I covered the rise of power from Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un. I covered the sort of constant tensions and saber rattling between North Korea and its neighbors and the United States. I covered its nuclear issue and nuclear ambitions as they went from, you know, the beginning of test firing rockets and the teaching of it to their people and the celebration of it all across the country, even in a karaoke bar. I covered the propaganda. This was a mass synchronized swim event where these swimmers were dancing to a song for Kim Jong-un's birthday called "We Will Defend Kim Jong-un from an Enemy Pillbox," or this, which is called the Mass Games, something that maybe if people know anything about North Korea, it's this 100 and some thousand citizens fill up this football stadium, and they sit in the stands and they hold these colored books and they flip these pages and create these mass moving mosaics of propaganda that when you sit in your seat look one way, but with the benefit of a long lens, you can see that these aren't pixels, but sort of human pixels with heads peeking out over the top. Eggs with legs. Sometimes you just have to shoot what's right in front of your eyes. So I gladly went to the propaganda, and I gladly went to sort of these things that made me wonder sometimes if they were real or not real, sort of Potemkin Village. And it's because I thought it was worthy of photographing, even if it wasn't the gritty real life of people, because this is the image that North Koreans were trying to project to the rest of the world. This was a department store where every item in the department store was made by North Korean hands, and they were very proud of this. We covered issues like health, and over the years, I got away from the propaganda and I got outside of the capital and further afield, where we drove thousands and thousands of miles in a van. A lot of the photography I did was just sort of through the window of the vehicle, and I was sometimes some of the best and most revealing photography that I did because no one knew I was coming and going, and it was just sort of a fleeting glimpse of real life for people. And I got further and further away from the scripted and the controlled to kind of let us feel something and feel empathy and get some understanding about who the North Korean people are. And I was able to do something that I think was most important, more important than the news photography that I did, but I was able to get into people's intimate spaces and into their lives and to look one another in the eyes and to know and to show that there were people in North Korea worthy of our understanding. It all started for me in 2000 when I was sent to South Korea to cover the 50th anniversary of the division of North and South Korea, and they held family reunions. This was the first time that people would have seen one another in 5 decades, and this was a woman I watched as these heartbreaking scenes happened, like this 90-year-old woman, almost totally blind, touching the face of her son that she hadn't seen in 50 years, trying to remember who he was. And then after 3 days, they just tore them apart, like these brothers, and put this North Korean man on the left back into a bus and drove him across the demilitarized zone back to North Korea, probably for them never to see one another again. And that same year, I also went inside North Korea for the first time. I traveled as the pool photographer for AP with then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who was sent to try and begin sort of negotiations towards a different kind of relationship with North Korea. It was the first time that I was in North Korea. It was the first time that I saw just how interesting, surreal, it was for me as a photographer, how I connected to it visually, but also just how important it was, and the kind of work that I felt I could do if I was tenacious enough and stuck with this, that I could do something that was really valuable and really important and really unique. It's not an easy place to work. You can't go anywhere without your guide or minder, and a guide or a minder is sort of part facilitator, part translator, and part sort of babysitter, constantly keeping an eye on you. They never censored my work. They never put their hand in front of my camera. They never stopped me from working. I was able to transmit work from inside North Korea. But the way that I was able to it began with a lot of control, and over time they began to understand what it is that I was trying to do, and that was to just open a window on to this place that most people in the world don't know about, and make that connections can be made between the people of North Korea and the people outside of North Korea. And I believe that photography can do that and many more things. I'm a true believer in the power of photography, and what better place but North Korea to test the power of photography. It has a mood and a meaning, carries mood and meaning that like no other medium can carry. Photography is open to interpretation. So when North Koreans took me to this place, which was a school for children learning about agriculture, they were very proud of this. They saw this as a very high-tech, very nurturing environment. And to us, we see this photograph as something in a different way. And so I walked that line as a photographer when I was there. It has sort of multiple layers, photography does. I was taken to the square one day, and there wasn't much to photograph except I looked at my feet, these spots on the ground. Those are coordinates, so that when North Koreans, people living in Pyongyang, the capital, are called out to a mass gathering to celebrate the dear leader, every single person had their own coordinate where they would stand and where they would march. I was taken to this place to show this new skyline, newly constructed, brightly lit, beautiful modern architecture. But I also found this woman sitting outside using the light of this new housing development to read and do her homework because she didn't have power inside her house. Photography is powerful because you can't turn away from it. And when I had very hard discussions, as I often did with North Korean officials, I always won the argument because I could say, you were there with me, this is what we saw. And so in all my years working there, what I wanted to do was really quite simple. And that was just open a window onto a place that's previously sort of undiscovered. I used lots of different camera formats, including this Hasselblad panoramic old film camera. And I used it not only to be creative and create this sort of wide look at the world, but also because the North Korean miners are always looking at me, and I would wear this camera around my neck, and I had a cable release, and I would just sort of walk around and try to be charming and hit the shutter button from the cable. And I think that they thought, well, he's just using that old-timey camera. He can't really do any harm with that. And so I was able to kind of make pictures that I wouldn't normally be able to make sometimes. And I used a 6x6 Mamiya 6. This camera was like even more effective in that way because I was so clumsy and so bad at it that I'd open up the back of the camera and I was so fumbling and clumsy that I think they just felt sorry for me and stopped paying attention to any of the work that I was doing with this camera. And then one day I brought my iPhone. Up until 2011, it was illegal to bring a phone into North Korea. And then one day they said you could bring your device into the country. They used to, when you arrived at the airport, they'd stick in a little bag, pull it shut, lock it up. You go in the country. When you came out, they'd give it back to you, probably with malware attached to it. But then, not only did they let us bring our phones into the country, but they created their own network, Koryo Link. And so suddenly I was able to do everything that I would do with my phone anywhere else in the world. I was Instagramming, tweeting, sending emails, making phone calls from the streets. I started using Foursquare to sort of mark all my locations. I was named the mayor of Juche Tower through Foursquare. I was doing Yelp reviews of restaurants. And I was going onto Google Maps, which by the way was completely empty. Like, where else could you feel like kind of like a great explorer? You know, I was naming streets, naming places along with the reporter. You know, they had this sort of carte blanche there with technology. And it had this interesting effect, especially on Instagram, because there I was photographing for the newspapers and magazines of the world with my big professional camera. And then I also had my phone that I was making pictures. And people started saying like, you know, have you seen the Instagram account coming out of North Korea? Like, I don't believe the mainstream media. I don't believe all those like magazine, newspaper pictures. But what I do believe is what I'm seeing on social media. It's gritty, it's from the streets, it's subversive. And yet it was the same guy, same photographer, but just with a different camera and a different platform. I was able to photograph things that I wouldn't normally be able to photograph with my phone. Normally, you're not supposed to have, you know, free photography of military, but everybody has a phone in North Korea, even North Korea. And so to pull out your phone and to make a picture was just sort of ignored. And it made me stop and photograph things that I wouldn't maybe normally have photographed with my real cameras. You know, you're rushing to the news with your big fancy DSLR, but sometimes with your phone, I would stop and I would see something quiet and not necessarily newsworthy, but interesting, beautiful. And in the end, it would be a piece of a puzzle and it would reveal something when you put them all together, something about the country. And everything became a picture for me at that point. Every little object that I saw. You know, The Great Teacher of Journalists, a book that the leader wrote to teach us all about how to be photojournalists. Postcards from the inaugural launch of one of its rockets. This is wild mountain mushroom alcohol. Hangover chaser tea after you drink the wild mountain mushroom alcohol. Beautiful watercolors from the DMZ. This is a debit card people use to pay in restaurants and taxis. And I think this is surprising to some people. And this, porcupine quill toothpicks. So my phone became this creative, but also very powerful sort of tool and window to the outside world. I would sit in my room, nothing else to do at night except watch state-run North Korean television, and I would post pictures, and people would comment, and I would comment back, and they would ask questions, and I would answer, and it became this dynamic sort of conversation that I'd never experienced before as a photographer. You know, we normally publish our pictures sort of at people, and there's no kind of opportunity for people to sort of, for it to be a conversation, to be dynamic in that way. And that was something that I learned there through social media, and at a time when Instagram was just, you know, coming into its own in 2011 and 2012. And everything was a photograph for me, even my lunch and any people that I met along the way. And, you know, one of the things that happened is I started to be followed, not by just, you know, my mom and a few other friends, but it grew and grew into over 1 million followers as it is today. And remember, the first newspaper I worked for had a circulation of 9,000. So the power of the scale of this audience, but also the fact that people, they follow you, they literally sort of go along with you wherever you go. They become invested in the stories that you're telling. They become invested in the people who you're photographing and the places that are important. And this is something that like really changed photography for me and changed our industry. And I feel like maybe younger photographers might feel that this has always been there, but it hasn't always been there. And when I said that what I wanted to do as a photographer was just simply open a window onto this world, it was social media and it was my phone that did that more effectively than any other way, and any other platform, and any other camera. So I've made my career traveling all over the world. It's been an amazing opportunity and heavy responsibility. And I'm so grateful for the career in life that I've had as a photojournalist. But 2020 is a new challenge for all of us. And for me, it's that I can't go and do my work the way that I normally would have. When the coronavirus hit us all at the end of March, I think we all sort of looked in the mirror and thought, what are we going to do? How are we going to do this? And for me, it was to go and see what I could photograph in my own backyard. What is it that's important about the coronavirus to me and to my community and to the people and the places that I can reach safely and responsibly? And so I think what we've all had to do is look inward and look at our own families and look at our own communities and to decide what it is that we can contribute in our own backyard and from our own lives as photographers. How can we photograph this coronavirus safely and responsibly? And what is it that's unique about it in your own community? This is a little lake that's half a block from my house. And this was the first photograph that I made. I walked down and I saw people sitting on the tops of their cars, social distanced, watching the sunset like it was some big nature's cinema across the lake and across the sky. And I realized when I saw this that I could say something about what we were all experiencing, what was unique about my community, but also what was universal for all of us around the world who are facing this at the same time. I covered it as a news story too. This is a man who contracted the coronavirus working in a meatpacking plant in Nebraska. I photographed him through the window, one of the ways that we found that we can photograph people safely and responsibly. I feel like we've had to develop a new language as photographers throughout this pandemic. You know, what is it that, how is it that we're going to photograph this? What's the unique sort of visual style that we are going to adopt to tell the story? And for me, it's sort of a cross between, you know, what would be normally very mundane, someone shopping, and what would look totally dystopian, someone in a sort of old era gas mask. And we've had to develop all kinds of new normals in the way that we work. I've been using a drone, but not, you know, a drone at 400 feet looking down at a landscape. I've been using a drone to photograph the people that I meet along the way because it's a safe and kind of strange, surreal sort of look at the world. I met this guy, his name's Dave. It was his 50th birthday. He was standing in front of his house with all these balloons and funny hat, and people were driving by and honking, and I lofted my drone just 20 feet in the air and sat on the trunk of my car and just made pictures as he waved at people driving by. And this is how I've been working. I walk up to people and say, can I take a picture of you with my social distance flying camera? And they say, do what you got to do. And I leave my email and they write back to me and they tell me these long stories about what they're facing, what they're experiencing, people kind of stuck inside and ready to really talk and really tell their own stories. I found out after photographing this family who came to a graduation ceremony on the street that we were actually cousins in a small town in Iowa where my parents grew up. And so this story is something that I've never experienced, and that is, it's something that's hitting each and every one of us, no matter where we are in the world. And it's forced us all to kind of ask ourselves as photographers and as people, how are we going to live with this? What are our roles and responsibilities around this? And for me to do this, essentially for the first time in my life, in my own community and in my own backyard, has been one of the most rewarding things that I've ever done, because it's I've been able to contribute something unique and continue to have my purpose as a photojournalist.